The depot master had stopped looking at her 3 days ago. Eliza Quinn sat on the splintered bench outside Black Hollow Station, her traveling dress heavy with rainwater and her valise wedged between her ankles like an anchor. The telegram she'd received 6 weeks prior sat folded in her coat pocket, the ink bleeding now from moisture and handling. But she didn't need to read it again. She had every word memorized. Miss Quinn. Stop, arrive. Black Hollow Station, November 3rd. Stop, will meet you. Stop, Thomas Garrett. November 3rd had come and gone. So had the 4th. Now it was the 5th, and the only thing meeting her was cold wind and the stares of strangers who pretended not to see a woman unraveling at the edges. She'd sold everything she owned to buy the train ticket west. Her mother's silver brush, the cameo her grandmother left her, even the small writing desk that had belonged to her father before the factory accident took him. All of it gone, converted into the promise of a new life with a man she'd never met, but whose letters had been kind, whose words had painted pictures of wide-open land and a future built on something other than the cramped Philadelphia boarding house where she'd spent 5 years serving other people's meals and washing other people's sheets. Thomas Garrett's letters had smelled like hope. They'd described a ranch 40 miles north of Black Hollow, cattle in the hundreds, and a house with real glass windows overlooking a valley so green it hurt to look at. He'd written about loneliness in careful sentences, about wanting a partner instead of just a housekeeper, about building something that mattered. Eliza had written back 3 letters, each one a little braver than the last. She told him about Philadelphia, about losing her parents, about the boarding house and Mrs. Callahan's sharp tongue and the way her hands had started to crack from lye soap. She'd told him she wasn't afraid of hard work, that she knew how to make a home from nothing. His final letter had included the telegram information and exact instructions. November 3rd. Black Hollow Station. He'd be waiting. But when Eliza stepped off the train into the rain with her valise and her carefully packed trunk, there was no one. Just the depot master, a thin man named Horace, who'd glanced at her ticket, shrugged, and said, "Thomas Garrett didn't live around here. Never heard of him. No ranch 40 miles north, no cattle, no house with glass windows, nothing." The other passengers had scattered into waiting wagons or walked toward the cluster of buildings that made up Black Hollow proper. Eliza had stood there as the rain soaked through her hat and coat, as her trunk sat in the mud beside the tracks, and felt the bottom drop out of her carefully constructed future. She tried asking around. The depot master had been no help. A woman at the mercantile had looked at her like she'd crawled out of the mud. The man at the hotel, a sagging 2-story structure that smelled like mildew and tobacco, had quoted her a price she couldn't afford for more than 2 nights, and that was sharing a room with 3 other women. Eliza had spent those 2 nights lying awake on a straw mattress, listening to the rain hammer the roof, and trying to figure out what came next. By the 3rd day, her money was gone. The hotel owner had set her trunk outside with a look that said, "Don't come back," and she'd returned to the station because there was nowhere else to go. That's where she'd been sitting for 72 hours, watching trains come and go, watching people avoid her eyes, trying to decide if she had enough coins left for a ticket back east, or if she should just walk into the rain and keep going until something stopped her. The storm hadn't let up. November in Wyoming didn't ask permission, it just took what it wanted. The wind came in hard from the north, shaking the awning overhead and sending sheets of water across the platform. Eliza's hands were numb. Her feet had stopped hurting hours ago, which she knew wasn't a good sign. The depot master had gone inside and locked the door. She was alone. That's when she saw the rider. He came out of the rain like something half-formed, a dark shape on a darker horse, moving slowly along the muddy track that passed for a road. Most riders would have hurried through weather like this, pushed for shelter, but this one didn't. He rode like he had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. Eliza watched him approach. There wasn't much else to do. He was tall in the saddle, shoulders broad beneath a long coat that had seen better years. His hat was pulled low, brim shedding water in a steady stream. The horse beneath him was a big roan, well-muscled and patient, the kind of animal that trusted its rider enough to walk through hell if asked. The man slowed as he neared the station. His head turned slightly, and even through the rain, Eliza felt his gaze land on her. It wasn't curiosity, it wasn't pity, it was something colder, assessment, the kind of look that measured a person and filed the information away without comment. She didn't move, didn't look away. She was too tired for pride and too empty for shame. The rider stopped his horse 10 feet from the platform. Water dripped from the brim of his hat as he studied her. Up close, she could see more details. A face weathered by sun and wind, hard lines around the mouth, eyes the color of winter slate. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old either. Somewhere in that in-between place where age stopped being a number and started being a condition. "You waiting for someone?" His voice was rough, like it didn't get used much. Eliza almost laughed. The question was so absurd given the circumstances that it nearly broke something inside her. Instead, she just shook her head. "You got somewhere to go?" Another shake. The truth was easier than explaining. The man sat there for a long moment, rain pouring off him, his horse shifting its weight. He looked at her valise, at her soaked dress, at the way she was gripping the bench like it might float away. Then he looked toward the depot building, dark and locked, and something moved across his face. Not sympathy, more like recognition. "How long you been sitting here?" 3 days. Her voice came out hoarse. She hadn't spoken to anyone since yesterday morning. His jaw tightened. "Anyone offer you help?" "No?" Another pause. The horse snorted, shaking its mane. The man reached up and adjusted his hat, water streaming down. When he spoke again, his tone hadn't changed, but there was something underneath it now. Something that might have been anger, though it wasn't aimed at her. "You got money for a room?" "No." "Family coming?" "No." He nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd already guessed. Then he swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion, boots hitting the mud with a wet sound. He was even bigger standing up, broad through the chest and shoulders, moving with the kind of easy strength that came from years of hard work. He walked up onto the platform, close enough now that Eliza could see the scar running along his jawline, the calluses on his hands, the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers. He wasn't comfortable with this. Whatever he was about to do, it wasn't coming easy. "I got a cabin about 8 miles north of here," he said. "It's not much, but it's dry, and there's a stove. You can stay there until you figure out what's next." Eliza stared at him. It had to be a trick. Or a trap. Men didn't just offer shelter to stranded women out of kindness. There was always a cost. "Why?" The word came out sharper than she intended. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment she saw past the hard exterior to something raw underneath, something that understood being stranded, being abandoned, being left in the rain with nowhere to go. Because no one should have to sit in the cold for 3 days while people walk past and pretend not to see. The simplicity of it nearly undid her. Eliza felt her throat tighten, felt the burn behind her eyes that meant tears were coming whether she wanted them or not. She swallowed hard, forcing them back. "I don't even know your name." "Rowan Mercer." "I'm Eliza Quinn." He nodded once, like that settled it. Then he bent down and picked up her valise without asking, slinging it over his shoulder like it weighed nothing. "You got anything else?" "A trunk. The hotel owner put it outside." "I'll get it. Wait here." He walked back down into the rain, leading his horse toward the main street. Eliza watched him go, her mind racing. This could be a mistake. He could be anyone. She could end up worse off than she already was. But worse than sitting in the rain with no money, no food, and no future. Worse than freezing to death on a train platform while the depot master pretended she didn't exist? She didn't think so. Rowan Mercer returned 15 minutes later with her trunk tied behind his saddle and a second horse, a smaller mare, older but steady-looking, trailing on a lead rope. He didn't explain where he'd gotten the mare, and Eliza didn't ask. He just handed her the reins and helped her into the saddle without ceremony, his hands firm and impersonal. "It's an hour's ride, he said, swinging back up onto the roan. "Stay close. The trail gets rough in places." Then he turned his horse north and started riding, and Eliza followed because there was nothing else left to do. The rain didn't stop. They rode through it in silence, following a narrow trail that wound between low hills and patches of scrub pine. The land here was different from anything Eliza had seen before, vast and empty in a way that made Philadelphia feel like a fever dream. There were no buildings, no streets, no people, just endless rolling country that disappeared into gray mist. Rowan Mercer rode ahead, his back straight, his horse moving at a steady walk. He didn't look back to check on her, didn't make conversation, just kept going like he'd made a decision, and now he was seeing it through to the end. Eliza focused on staying in the saddle. She wasn't a strong rider. Her experience with horses began and ended with the delivery wagons in Philadelphia, but the mare beneath her seemed to understand that. It followed Rowan's roan without much guidance, navigating the muddy trail with careful steps. By the time they reached the cabin, full dark had settled in, and the rain had turned to a cold drizzle that was somehow worse than the downpour. Rowan dismounted and led both horses toward a small lean-to structure attached to the side of the building. Eliza slid down from the mare, her legs shaking from cold and exhaustion, and stood in the mud while he worked. The cabin itself was small, just one room from the look of it, built from rough-cut logs with a stone chimney at one end. There were 2 windows, both shuttered against the weather, and a narrow porch that sagged slightly to one side. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Rowan finished with the horses and came back carrying her valise and trunk. He nodded toward the door. "Go on inside. I'll be in after I get a fire started." Eliza climbed the 2 steps to the porch and pushed open the door. The interior was dark and smelled like old smoke and dust. She stood just inside, dripping onto the floor, waiting for her eyes to adjust. Gradually, shapes emerged. A table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the far wall, a cast-iron stove in the corner, shelves holding tins and jars, a few pegs on the wall for coats. It was sparse in the way that places become when no one cares about them anymore. Functional, empty. Rowan came in behind her, moving past to the stove without a word. He worked efficiently, clearing out old ash, laying kindling, striking a match. Within minutes, a small flame was crackling inside, and he started adding larger pieces of wood. "There's a well out back," he said, still crouched by the stove. "Water's clean. Outhouse is about 20 yards east. You'll see the path. There's cornmeal in the tin on the shelf, some beans, salt pork. Help yourself to whatever's there." Eliza stood in the middle of the room, still dripping, still trying to process what was happening. "Where will you sleep?" "The lean-to's got space. I'll make do." "That's not... You can't sleep out there. It's freezing." He stood up, brushing his hands on his pants. "I've slept in worse." "But this is your cabin. I can't just..." "You can." His tone was flat, final. "I offered. You accepted. That's the end of it." He moved toward the door and panic fluttered in Eliza's chest. "Wait." Rowan stopped, his hand on the doorframe, but he didn't turn around. "I don't understand why you're doing this." His shoulders tensed. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, so quietly she almost didn't hear it over the rain. 3 years ago, my wife died in childbirth. The baby, too. I was working a cattle drive 200 miles north. By the time I got word and made it back, they'd already buried her. He paused. The neighbors knew she was in trouble. They heard her calling for help, but no one came. They said they didn't want to intrude, didn't want to overstep. Eliza's breath caught. "So when I see someone who needs help," Rowan continued, still not looking at her, "I don't walk past. I don't pretend I didn't see. I do something about it." Then he walked out into the rain and closed the door behind him. Eliza stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, her wet clothes clinging to her skin and her mind reeling. She'd expected 100 different things from this night: violence, demands, conditions, but not that. Not raw honesty wrapped in so much pain it made her chest ache. Finally, she moved, stripped off her wet coat and hung it on one of the pegs, unlaced her boots and set them by the stove to dry, found a blanket folded on the bed and wrapped it around her shoulders. The cabin warmed slowly as the fire grew. Eliza sat at the table and stared at the flame through the stove's open door, exhaustion pressing down on her like a physical weight. She should eat something, should change into dry clothes, should do 100 practical things. Instead, she sat there and let herself feel it, all of it. The fear, the relief, the bone-deep weariness of traveling 2,000 miles for a lie. The strange, complicated gratitude for a man who'd saved her, not because he wanted something, but because someone he loved had needed saving once and no one came. Outside, the rain drummed against the roof, and somewhere in the darkness, Rowan Mercer was settling into a cold lean-to because he'd given his bed to a stranger. Eliza pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes. She'd figure out tomorrow when it came. Morning arrived gray and cold. Eliza woke to silence. The rain had finally stopped, and for a moment she didn't know where she was. Then memory returned in a rush. The station, the rider, the cabin. She sat up quickly, the blanket falling away, and looked around the small room. Everything was exactly as it had been last night. The fire had burned down to embers. Her boots sat by the stove, dry now. Her valise and trunk were stacked near the foot of the bed. The cabin was empty except for her. She stood, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles, and moved to the window, pushed open the shutter, and looked out at a world transformed. The storm had cleared, leaving behind brilliant blue sky and that particular quality of light that comes after heavy rain. The land stretched out in rolling waves of brown grass and rock, broken here and there by dark patches of pine. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Movement caught her eye. Rowan was outside, working near the lean-to. He'd taken off his coat despite the cold and was brushing down his horse with long, methodical strokes. Even from a distance, she could see the careful attention he paid to the animal, checking hooves, running his hands along the legs, speaking quietly in a voice too low to make out words. Eliza watched him work. In daylight, she could see more clearly what the rain had hidden. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 35, maybe 40. His dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples. The scar on his jaw stood out white against tanned skin. He moved like someone who'd spent his whole life working with his body, efficient and economical in every gesture. There was something lonely about him, not in the obvious way, but in the quiet spaces between actions. The way he worked alone, the way he didn't seem to expect company or conversation, the way this cabin felt less like a home and more like a place he happened to sleep. She pulled back from the window before he could notice her watching. The stove was cold, so she rebuilt the fire the way she'd seen him do it, kindling first, then larger pieces, patience until it caught. While it heated, she found the tin of cornmeal and started figuring out breakfast. There was a basin for washing, a few utensils, a single pot. Not much, but enough. By the time Rowan came inside, she had cornmeal mush cooking on the stove and coffee brewing in a battered pot. He stopped in the doorway, surprise flickering across his face before he hit it. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." Eliza stirred the pot. "But you gave me shelter. Least I can do is make breakfast." He hesitated, then stepped inside and closed the door, hung his coat on a peg, moved to the basin and washed his hands with the careful thoroughness of someone who'd worked around animals. When he sat down at the table, his movements were cautious, like he wasn't sure what the rules were anymore. Eliza served the food in 2 tin bowls and poured coffee into 2 cups. She sat across from him, and for a moment neither of them moved. The situation was too strange, too domestic, too full of unspoken questions. Finally, Rowan picked up his spoon and started eating. Eliza did the same. They ate in silence. The food was plain but warm, the coffee strong and bitter. Outside, a crow called from somewhere in the distance. Inside, the fire crackled quietly in the stove. When they'd finished, Rowan pushed back from the table and looked at her directly for the first time since last night. "You'll want to figure out your next step," he said. Not unkindly, but firmly. "This can't be permanent." "I know. There's work in town sometimes. The hotel takes on help. The mercantile might need someone. It's not much, but it's something." Eliza nodded. She'd been thinking the same thing. "I'll ride back to Black Hollow today. Start asking around." "I'll take you. You don't have to. I'm heading that way anyway." He stood up, ending the discussion. "We'll leave in an hour." The ride back to Black Hollow was different in daylight. The trail that had seemed treacherous in the rain was just a worn path through open country. The hills Eliza had imagined as menacing were gentle slopes covered in dry grass. The whole landscape had changed, or maybe she'd just been too tired and scared to see it clearly the first time. Rowan rode ahead again, but this time he pointed things out as they went. A creek that ran year-round, a stand of cottonwoods that marked good grazing land, the distant mountains to the west where snow already capped the peaks. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were deliberate, purposeful. Like he'd spent so much time alone that conversation had become something he had to think about instead of something that just happened. "You know anything about keeping house?" he asked as they crested a low rise. "I worked in a boarding house for 5 years, cooking, cleaning, mending. I can manage most things." He nodded slowly. "That'll help. People here respect work. They don't care much about where you came from or why, long as you pull your weight." "Is that true for everyone, or just people who aren't strangers?" Rowan glanced back at her, something that might have been humor in his eyes. Fair point. You'll get some sideways looks, but if you keep your head down and do the work, they'll come around. How long did it take them to come around to you? Still waiting. This time Eliza smiled despite herself. There was something oddly comforting about his bluntness. No false promises, no pretty lies, just the truth, plain and unvarnished. They reached Black Hollow around mid-morning. The town was bigger than Eliza had realized when she'd arrived in the rain, maybe 200 people, with a main street of wooden buildings facing each other across a wide, muddy avenue. There was the hotel, the mercantile, a blacksmith, a doctor's office, a saloon, and a church with a tilted steeple that looked like it might fall over if the wind hit it wrong. People stopped to watch as they rode in. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A woman sweeping her porch froze with the broom in her hands. Eliza felt the weight of their stares like something physical. Rowan seemed not to notice. He rode straight to the mercantile and dismounted, tying his horse to the rail like this was the most normal thing in the world. Eliza followed his lead, trying not to meet anyone's eyes. Inside the mercantile, a barrel-chested man with a thick beard stood behind the counter. He looked up when they entered, his gaze moving from Rowan to Eliza and back again. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Mercer. Clayton. Rowan moved to the counter. Miss Quinn here is looking for work. She's got experience keeping house, cooking, mending. Thought maybe you'd know if anyone's hiring. Clayton's eyes settled on Eliza with uncomfortable intensity. This the woman who was stuck at the station? She is. Where's she been staying? The question hung in the air like smoke. Eliza opened her mouth to answer, but Rowan spoke first, his voice flat and hard. She's been staying in my cabin. I offered her shelter when no one else would. Clayton's eyebrows rose. That right? That's right. A long pause. The mercantile owner looked at Eliza again, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his words were careful. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house might need help. She's getting on in years, and the place is more than she can handle alone. Can't promise anything, but it's worth asking. Where's the boarding house? Eliza asked. East end of town. Blue paint. Can't miss it. Thank you. Clayton nodded but didn't smile. The whole exchange had the feeling of something transactional. Information given, debt noted, judgment reserved. They left the mercantile and stood on the wooden walkway outside. More people were watching now, not even pretending to mind their own business. A cluster of women near the hotel whispered behind their hands. Two men outside the saloon had stopped their conversation entirely. They're going to talk, Eliza said quietly. Let them. It'll cause problems for you. Rowan looked at her, his winter gray eyes steady. I don't live my life worried about what people think. Neither should you. Then he walked toward the horses, leaving Eliza standing there with those words ringing in her ears. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was exactly where Clayton said it would be. A two-story structure with fading blue paint and a sagging porch that had seen better decades. Eliza knocked on the door and waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. The woman who answered was small and bent with age, her hair completely white and pulled back in a tight bun. She looked Eliza up and down with sharp, dark eyes that missed nothing. Help you? My name is Eliza Quinn. Mr. Clayton at the mercantile said you might need help with the boarding house. Did he now? Mrs. Henderson's gaze flicked past Eliza to where Rowan waited with the horses, then back again. You the one who was stranded at the station? There was no point in lying. Yes, ma'am. And you've been staying with Rowan Mercer? He offered me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. Mrs. Henderson made a sound that could have been disapproval or amusement. It was hard to tell. Come inside. Let's talk. Eliza followed her into a front room that smelled like old wood and lye soap. The boarding house was clean but worn, with furniture that had been mended multiple times, and floors that creaked with every step. Mrs. Henderson sat in a rocking chair and gestured for Eliza to take the sofa. I'll be plain with you, the old woman said. I need help. My hands aren't what they used to be, and keeping this place running is more than I can manage alone. I need someone who can cook, clean, do laundry, and handle the boarders without causing drama. I can do all of that. Experience? 5 years at a boarding house in Philadelphia. I did everything from cooking meals to mending linens to managing accounts when the owner was ill. Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly. Pay would be room and board plus $2 a week. Rooms in the attic, small, but it's yours. Meals with the boarders. Work 6 days, Sundays off. No drinking, no men in your room, no trouble. That's more than fair. There's one more thing. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward slightly, her eyes boring into Eliza's. People are going to talk about you. They're going to say things. Some of it will be ugly. Can you handle that? Eliza thought about the last 3 days. About sitting in the rain while strangers walked past. About losing everything she owned for a lie. About being so desperate that accepting help from a man she didn't know seemed like the safest option available. Yes, ma'am, I can handle it. Mrs. Henderson studied her for another long moment, then slapped her hands on her knees. All right then, you can start tomorrow. Be here at 6 in the morning. Relief flooded through Eliza so suddenly she felt dizzy. Thank you. I won't let you down. See that you don't. When Eliza came back outside, Rowan was leaning against the porch rail, his hat pulled low against the sun. He straightened when he saw her face. You got it? I start tomorrow. Something that might have been satisfaction flickered across his features. Good. They rode back to the cabin in comfortable silence. The sun was high now, burning off the last of the morning cold, and the land looked different again, still harsh, still empty, but somehow less hostile. Or maybe that was just Eliza's mood shifting. When they reached the cabin, Rowan helped her down from the mare and then stood there, awkward in a way he hadn't been before. You'll want to pack your things, he said. I can take you back to town in the morning, get you settled at the boarding house. All right. He nodded, then turned toward the lean-to. Stopped, turned back. If you need anything, if Mrs. Henderson doesn't work out, or if there's trouble, you come find me. Understand? Eliza looked at this man who'd saved her from the rain, who'd given her shelter without asking for anything in return, who'd stood in the mercantile and dared people to judge him for doing the right thing. I understand. Thank you, Rowan, for everything. He shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. Just did what needed doing. Then he walked away to tend his horse, and Eliza went inside to pack her valise for the second time in as many days. But this time, it felt different. This time, she wasn't packing for a lie or a desperate escape. She was packing for a future she'd earned herself. And when she looked out the window at the wide Wyoming sky, she thought maybe, just maybe, she could make a life here after all, even if it wasn't the one she'd planned. The attic room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was smaller than a horse stall and about as welcoming. A narrow iron bed frame held a thin mattress that sagged in the middle. A single wooden chair sat beneath a window barely large enough to fit Eliza's head through, and the walls sloped so sharply that she could only stand upright in the center of the room. But it was hers. That mattered more than the size. Eliza set her valise on the bed and looked around. The floorboards were uneven, gaps between them wide enough to see down into the room below. A hook on the back of the door served as the only closet. The window faced east, which meant morning light, but also meant the room would be freezing come winter. She'd survived worse. The boarding house in Philadelphia had kept her in a basement room that flooded every spring and grew mold on the walls. At least here she could see sky. Breakfast is at 6, lunch at noon, supper at 6. Mrs. Henderson's voice drifted up the narrow staircase. Boarders expect hot food and plenty of it. Coffee needs to be strong enough to strip paint. Any questions? No, ma'am. Good. Get settled. I'll expect you downstairs in an hour to start learning the routine. Eliza heard the old woman's footsteps retreat, each one accompanied by the creak of protesting wood. She sat on the bed, which groaned under her weight, and let herself feel the exhaustion that had been building since she'd left Philadelphia. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her knees until they stilled. 1 week ago, she'd believed her life was about to change. She'd believed Thomas Garrett's letters, believed in the ranch and the future he'd described, believed that someone actually wanted her for more than just the work she could provide. She'd been wrong about all of it. The Thomas Garrett who'd written those letters probably didn't exist. Or if he did, he'd written to a dozen women, maybe more, collecting responses like some men collected stamps. Eliza had no way of knowing, no way of finding out. The only thing she knew for certain was that she'd sold everything she owned for a fantasy. But sitting here feeling sorry for herself wasn't going to change anything. She'd learned that lesson years ago when her father died and left them with nothing but debts. Grief and anger were luxuries she couldn't afford. Eliza stood, unpacked her few belongings, and went downstairs to start her new life. The boarding house had 6 rooms for rent and currently held 4 boarders. Mrs. Henderson introduced them over the course of that first afternoon as Eliza learned the layout of the kitchen, the location of the root cellar, and the temperamental nature of the cast-iron stove that required coaxing like a stubborn mule. Samuel Briggs worked at the sawmill and took his meals in silence, barely looking up from his plate. He was maybe 50, weathered and lean, with sawdust permanently embedded in his hair. The Carlson brothers, Pete and Jack, were railroad workers who shared a room and finished each other's sentences in a way that made Eliza's head hurt. They were loud, cheerful, and tracked mud everywhere they went, despite Mrs. Henderson's constant scolding. And then there was Margaret Chen, a widow who kept the town's only laundry service running out of a building behind the mercantile. She was the only woman boarder, and she watched Eliza with dark, assessing eyes that gave nothing away. "That's the woman from the station," Pete Carlson said that first evening at supper, his voice carrying across the dining room. "The one who got left behind." "Pete," Mrs. Henderson said sharply. "Mind your manners." "Just making conversation. Make it about something else." Jack Carlson grinned. "Heard she was staying out at Rowan Mercer's place. That true?" The table went quiet. Even Samuel Briggs looked up from his plate. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her eyes on the potatoes she was mashing and didn't respond. "She was stranded with nowhere to go," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice hard as iron. "Rowan did the decent thing and offered shelter. Anyone here got a problem with that, you can take it up with me." Pete held up his hands. "No problem, Mrs. Henderson. Just curious is all." "Curiosity killed the cat." "Good thing I'm not a cat. Keep talking and I'll treat you like one. Now eat your supper and stop pestering my help." The conversation shifted to safer topics, the railroad schedule, weather predictions, whose horse had thrown a shoe. But Eliza could feel the weight of unspoken questions hanging in the air. These people wanted to know her story, wanted to know why she'd come to Black Hollow, why she'd been abandoned, what had happened between her and Rowan Mercer. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. After supper, she washed dishes in the kitchen while Mrs. Henderson supervised from a chair by the stove. The old woman's hands were gnarled with arthritis, the joints swollen and stiff, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "You handled that well," Mrs. Henderson said. "Handled what?" "The questions, the nosiness. Most girls your age would have either burst into tears or started explaining themselves. You did neither." Eliza scrubbed at a stubborn spot on a plate. "I learned a long time ago that explaining yourself just gives people more ammunition." "Smart girl." Mrs. Henderson shifted in her chair, wincing. "People in this town have nothing better to do than gossip. They'll talk about you for a while, then something more interesting will happen, and they'll move on. Just keep your head down and your mouth shut." "Yes, ma'am." "And Eliza?" She looked up. "Whatever brought you to Black Hollow, whatever happened at that station, it's your business. I don't need to know, and I won't ask. But I will tell you this. Rowan Mercer isn't the kind of man who helps people expecting something in return. If he offered you shelter, it's because you needed it. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of that." Eliza's throat tightened. "Thank you." Mrs. Henderson waved a dismissive hand. "Now finish those dishes and get some rest. Tomorrow starts early." That night, Eliza lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the boarding house settling around her. Footsteps on the stairs, muffled voices through thin walls, the wind rattling the window frame. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. She thought about Rowan Mercer alone in his cabin, caring for his horses in the lean-to, sitting at that table, built for 2, but only ever occupied by 1. She thought about his wife and the baby who'd died while he was 200 miles away. She thought about the neighbors who'd heard cries for help and decided not to intrude. Some wounds didn't heal. They just became part of the landscape you learned to navigate. Eliza closed her eyes and waited for sleep to come. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm. Wake before dawn, start the stove, brew coffee strong enough to wake the dead, prepare breakfast for 5 people plus Mrs. Henderson and herself, clean up from breakfast, prepare lunch, clean up from lunch, laundry on Mondays and Thursdays, mending whenever there was time, supper at 6, clean up afterward, fall into bed exhausted. It was hard work, but it was familiar. Eliza knew how to make a boarding house run. She knew how to stretch supplies, how to make tough meat tender, how to get blood stains out of sheets and grease stains out of work shirts. She knew how to be invisible when boarders wanted privacy, and how to be present when they needed something. Mrs. Henderson watched her work with approval that showed itself in small ways. A nod when the biscuits came out perfectly, an extra 50 cents added to her weekly pay after the first month, a shawl left on Eliza's bed when the nights turned cold. The boarders accepted her presence with varying degrees of warmth. Samuel Briggs continued to eat in silence but started saying thank you when she refilled his coffee. The Carlson brothers teased her the way they probably teased their sisters, if they had sisters, good-natured and mostly harmless. Margaret Chen remained reserved but occasionally helped with dishes without being asked, working alongside Eliza in companionable quiet. But outside the boarding house, Black Hollow watched Eliza Quinn with suspicion that never quite faded. She felt it every time she walked to the mercantile for supplies. The conversations that stopped when she entered. The way women pulled their children closer. The men who looked at her too long or looked away too fast. Clayton at the mercantile was always polite, but his politeness had edges. The doctor's wife crossed the street rather than pass Eliza on the wooden walkway. The blacksmith quoted her higher prices than he quoted Mrs. Henderson. The whispers followed her everywhere. That's her, the station woman. Living in Rowan Mercer's cabin for near a week, they say. Unchaperoned. Unmarried. You know what that means. Poor man's probably trying to do right by her now. Or maybe she trapped him into it. Eliza learned to keep her eyes forward and her expression neutral. She learned which shops to avoid and which times of day drew the smallest crowds. She learned to carry herself with a dignity that made it harder for people to whisper directly to her face. But it wore on her. The constant judgment, the assumptions, the way a simple act of kindness had been twisted into something sordid. She'd done nothing wrong, neither had Rowan. But that didn't matter to people who needed someone to talk about. She saw Rowan occasionally, always from a distance. He came to town every couple of weeks for supplies, riding in on that big roan, conducting his business with quiet efficiency, then riding back out. He never approached her, never acknowledged her beyond a brief nod if their paths crossed. Eliza told herself that was for the best. The less they were seen together, the faster the gossip would die. But part of her missed the strange, uncomplicated honesty of those few days in his cabin. Missed the way he'd spoken plainly instead of dancing around the truth. Missed having someone nearby who understood what it felt like to be judged for circumstances beyond your control. November gave way to December. The weather turned brutal, bringing snow that piled in drifts against the buildings and wind that cut through even the thickest coat. The boarding house became a haven of warmth and light, the kitchen stove burning constantly, windows fogged with condensation. One evening, about 6 weeks after Eliza had started work, Margaret Chen stayed behind after supper to help with dishes. They worked in silence for a while, the comfortable kind born of shared routine. Then Margaret spoke. People talk about me too, you know. Eliza glanced at her. Margaret was maybe 40, with streaks of gray in her black hair and a face that showed years of hard work. She kept to herself, never caused trouble, paid her rent on time. Why? Eliza asked. Because I'm Chinese, because my husband was white, because I run a business on my own. Margaret scrubbed at a pot with more force than necessary. Some people need someone to look down on, makes them feel bigger. How do you stand it? Same way you do. I work hard. I don't give them ammunition, and I remember that their opinions don't pay my bills or put food on my table. She set the pot aside and looked at Eliza directly. The gossip will fade eventually. Something else will happen. Someone else will do something worth talking about, and they'll forget all about you and Rowan Mercer. I hope you're right. I'm always right. Margaret almost smiled. Ask my late husband. Oh, wait, you can't. Because he finally admitted I was right about the rotten floorboard and then fell through it anyway. Eliza couldn't help it. She laughed. The sound surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time something had struck her as genuinely funny. Margaret's expression softened. You're going to be fine, Eliza Quinn. You're tougher than you look. How can you tell? Because you're still here. Plenty of women would have run back east by now, tail between their legs. But you stayed. You found work. You carved out a place for yourself in a town that didn't want you. Margaret dried her hands on a towel. That takes spine. After Margaret went upstairs, Eliza stood in the quiet kitchen and let those words settle over her. She'd never thought of herself as particularly tough, She'd just done what needed doing, the same way she always had. But maybe that was what toughness was. Not the absence of fear or hurt, but the decision to keep moving forward anyway. She banked the fire in the stove, checked the locks on the doors, and climbed the narrow stairs to her attic room. Outside, snow was falling again, thick and steady, turning Black Hollow into a study in white and shadow. Somewhere beyond the town, Rowan Mercer was probably settling in for the night, checking on his horses one last time, adding wood to his stove. Eliza wondered if he ever thought about those few days when his cabin had held 2 people instead of 1, if he missed the small domesticity of shared meals and quiet conversation, or if he was relieved to have his solitude back. She'd never know. And maybe that was how it needed to be. December deepened. Christmas came and went with little fanfare. Mrs. Henderson served a special supper of roast chicken and dried apple pie. The Carlson brothers got drunk and sang off-key carols until Samuel Briggs threatened to throw them out in the snow, and someone left a small package on Eliza's bed containing a pair of knitted mittens and no note. She suspected Mrs. Henderson, but the old woman denied it with such obvious insincerity that Eliza just thanked her and let it go. The new year arrived cold and clear. January brought temperatures so low that water froze in the basins overnight and breath crystallized in the air. The boarding house became a cocoon of warmth, boarders venturing out only when necessary, spending their evenings around the stove playing cards and telling stories. Eliza learned things about her fellow residents during those long winter nights. Samuel Briggs had been a soldier in the war and still sometimes woke screaming from nightmares he never discussed. The Carlson brothers had come west after their family farm in Ohio failed, looking for a fresh start and sending money home to their mother every month. Margaret Chen had met her husband when he'd brought his laundry to her father's shop in San Francisco, had married him despite both families' objections, and had followed him to Wyoming when he'd gotten work on the railroad. They were all running from something or toward something or both. Black Hollow was a town built on second chances and last chances, populated by people who'd made mistakes or had mistakes made for them. Eliza fit right in, whether the town wanted to admit it or not. One afternoon in late January, she was at the Mercantile picking up supplies when she heard raised voices from near the back of the store. She recognized one of them, Rowan Mercer, his tone flat and dangerous in a way that made her stomach tighten. "I'm telling you what I saw," another man's voice said. "Fresh tracks around the north pasture, fence cut in 2 places. That's the 3rd ranch hit this month." "You report it to the sheriff?" "For all the good that'll do. Davies couldn't find his own ass with both hands and a map." Eliza moved closer, pretending to examine canned goods while she listened. "Cattle rustling's getting worse," a third voice chimed in. "Heard the Morrison place lost near 20 head last week, just vanished overnight." "Organization like that, it's not just drifters," Rowan said. "Someone's planning this, someone who knows the territory." "Well, it ain't going to be me worrying about it much longer. I'm selling out come spring. Can't afford to lose any more stock." Clayton's voice cut across the conversation. "Gentlemen, if you're going to discuss criminal activity, kindly do it somewhere other than my store. You're scaring off customers." The group dispersed, grumbling. Eliza caught a glimpse of Rowan as he walked past. He looked tired, older somehow, with new lines around his eyes. He didn't notice her standing there, and she didn't call out to him, but the conversation stayed with her, cattle rustling, ranches being hit systematically, fear spreading through the community. She thought about Rowan alone in his cabin, vulnerable in isolation, with no one watching his back. Then she reminded herself it wasn't her concern. He'd helped her when she needed it, and she was grateful. But his life and hers had diverged after those few days. They were strangers again, or as close to strangers as 2 people could be after sharing shelter during a storm. That's what she told herself, anyway. The last week of January brought a brief warm spell that melted some of the snow and turned the streets into rivers of mud. Eliza was hanging laundry in the backyard, sheets that would freeze stiff but at least get some air, when she heard horses approaching. Not unusual. People came and went from the boarding house all the time, but something about these horses sounded different. Too many of them, moving too fast. She walked around to the front of the building and stopped. 6 riders sat mounted in the street, all carrying rifles, all watching the boarding house with hard expressions. At the center of the group sat a man Eliza recognized, Sheriff Tom Davies, a lazy excuse for a lawman who spent more time at the saloon than at his office. Mrs. Henderson stood on the porch, arms crossed, looking unimpressed. Help you, Sheriff? Looking for your hired girl, Eliza Quinn. Eliza's heart started pounding, but she forced herself to step forward. I'm Eliza Quinn. Davies turned his attention to her, his eyes cold. Need you to come with us. Got some questions. Questions about what? The bank robbery that happened 2 nights ago in Lewiston, 20 miles east of here. Eliza stared at him. I don't know anything about a bank robbery. That's so. Funny thing is, witness description matches you pretty close. Woman in her 20s, dark hair, traveling alone. Arrived in the area about 2 months back with no clear history. That describes half the women in Wyoming. Maybe so. But you're the one who showed up at a train station with a convenient story about being abandoned. The one who stayed at Rowan Mercer's cabin with no chaperone. The one who's been keeping her head down and her mouth shut ever since. Davies leaned forward in his saddle. That's what we call suspicious behavior, Miss Quinn. That's what I call surviving, Eliza shot back, anger flooding through her fear. I came here to meet someone who lied to me. I was stranded with no money and no options. Rowan Mercer offered help when no one else would. I've been working at this boarding house 6 days a week since I got here. Mrs. Henderson can vouch for that. Oh, she can she? Davies looked at the old woman. That true? Every word, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice sharp as broken glass. Eliza's been here from dawn to past dark most days. She was here 2 nights ago serving supper when your supposed robbery happened. I've got 4 boarders who'll testify to that. Convenient. It's called an alibi, you fool. One of the other riders spoke up. Sheriff, if she's got witnesses. Witnesses can be bought, Davies said, especially if the woman's been spreading money around. I don't have any money, Eliza said. I make $2 a week and send most of it towards saving for my own place. You can check with Clayton at the Mercantile. I buy on credit and pay it off every month. Davies didn't look convinced. You're coming with us anyway. We'll sort this out at the jail. Like hell she is. Mrs. Henderson stepped down from the porch, moving between Eliza and the mounted men. Despite her age and bent frame, there was something fierce in her stance. You got no evidence, no real cause, and no business harassing my employee. Eliza Quinn was here 2 nights ago. Period. End of story. Step aside, Mrs. Henderson. Make me. The standoff stretched. Davies looked like he wanted to push the issue, but backing down from an old woman in front of witnesses would make him look weak. And Mrs. Henderson clearly had no intention of moving. Finally, one of the other riders, a younger man with deputy written on his vest, cleared his throat. Sheriff, maybe we should follow up on the other leads first. Get more information before we start arresting people. Davies glared at him. I'm running this investigation. Yes, sir. Just suggesting we be thorough. The sheriff sat there for another long moment, then yanked his horse's reins hard enough to make the animal toss its head. This isn't over, Miss Quinn. I'll be watching you. Then the group rode off, leaving nothing but mud and tension in their wake. Eliza's legs went weak. She grabbed the porch railing to steady herself, her breath coming in short gasps. Mrs. Henderson put a hand on her shoulder. Easy now. They're gone. For now. For good, if I have anything to say about it. The old woman's hand tightened. That jackass Davies couldn't investigate his way out of a wet paper sack. He's just looking for someone to blame so he doesn't have to do real work. But what if people believe him? What if they think I'm involved? Mrs. Henderson snorted. People already think plenty about you and you've survived it. This will blow over the same way. Come on inside. I'll make tea. But it didn't blow over. By the next day, the whole town knew the sheriff had questioned Eliza about the robbery. The whispers that had been fading started up again with renewed energy. Women crossed the street to avoid her. Clayton at the Mercantile started watching her closely whenever she came in, like he expected her to steal something. Even the Carlson brothers looked at her sideways over breakfast. Only Margaret Chen seemed unmoved. Half this town would be in jail if Davies arrested everyone he suspected of something, she said, while helping with dishes that evening. He's an idiot with a badge. Ignore him. Hard to ignore when everyone's staring at me like I'm a criminal. Then let them stare. You know the truth. That's what matters. But knowing the truth didn't stop the fear that crawled up Eliza's spine every time she heard horses outside. Didn't stop her from checking over her shoulder when she walked through town. Didn't stop the nightmares where she was back at the station, alone in the rain, except this time no one came to help. 3 days after Davies's visit, Rowan Mercer showed up at the boarding house. Eliza was in the kitchen preparing supper when Mrs. Henderson called down the stairs. "Eliza, you've got a visitor." Her stomach dropped. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front room, half expecting to see the sheriff waiting to arrest her. Instead, Rowan Mercer stood just inside the doorway, hat in his hands, looking profoundly uncomfortable. Mrs. Henderson had made herself scarce, which meant they were alone. "Rowan?" "Eliza." He shifted his weight. "Heard about what happened with Davies?" "News travels fast. Always does." He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw anger in his eyes, not at her, for her. He had no right to come at you like that. No evidence, no cause, just suspicion based on you being a stranger. That's all it takes in this town, apparently. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Rowan moved closer, his voice dropping. "I talked to Davies, told him you were at my cabin the night of the robbery, that I'd brought you supplies and we had supper together." Eliza went cold. "You lied for me?" "I told him what needed telling." "Rowan, you can't. If he finds out you lied to a lawman—" "He won't find out, because it's not provable either way. Your word and mine against his suspicions." Rowan's jaw set in a hard line. "You didn't rob that bank. Everyone with half a brain knows it, but Davies needs someone to blame and you're convenient, so I'm making you inconvenient." "Why would you do that? It's just going to make things worse for you. People already talk about us. Now you're lying to protect me." "I'm telling the truth in the way that matters most," Rowan interrupted, "which is that you're innocent, and you don't deserve to be treated like a criminal just because you had bad luck and worse timing." They stood there in the quiet front room, the afternoon light slanting through the windows, and Eliza felt something shift in her chest. This man barely knew her, owed her nothing, had already done more for her than anyone had in years, and here he was, putting himself in the line of fire without hesitation. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but I can't let you keep doing this. Can't let you keep sacrificing your reputation for mine." "My reputation was shot the day I offered you shelter. Adding to it now doesn't change much. It changes everything if they decide you're lying to protect an accomplice." Rowan's expression softened slightly. "Let me worry about that. You just keep your head down and do your work. This will pass." "You don't know that. I know Davies is lazy, and this town has a short attention span. Something else will happen soon enough. It always does. And they'll forget all about suspecting you of bank robbery." Eliza wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the nightmare of the past few days would fade like morning frost. But fear had a way of burrowing deep and staying there. "I need to get back to supper," she said. Rowan nodded, settling his hat back on his head. He turned to leave, then stopped. "Eliza?" "Yes?" "If you need anything at all, you send word. Understand?" "I understand." He held her gaze for another moment, then walked out into the cold January afternoon, leaving Eliza standing alone with her thoughts and her gratitude and the growing realization that whatever existed between her and Rowan Mercer, it wasn't simple anymore, if it had ever been simple at all. The week after Rowan's visit brought more snow and more silence, the kind of silence that pressed down like a weight, heavy with unspoken accusations and sideways glances. Eliza moved through her days at the boarding house with mechanical precision, cooking, cleaning, serving meals to boarders who no longer met her eyes. Even the Carlson brothers had gone quiet, their usual jokes and easy banter replaced by uncomfortable throat-clearing and sudden interests in their plates. Samuel Briggs was the only one who seemed unchanged. He still ate in silence, still said his quiet thank yous, still looked at Eliza like she was just the woman who poured his coffee and nothing more. She found herself grateful for that small mercy. Margaret Chen stayed neutral in the way that only Margaret could, not defending Eliza, but not condemning her either, just existing alongside her in the same space, doing the same work, treating the whole situation like it was beneath her notice. Mrs. Henderson grew sharper with each passing day. She snapped at boarders who whispered too loudly, refused service to anyone who came asking questions about that Quinn woman, and made it clear that anyone who had a problem with her hired help could find somewhere else to live. "I won't have gossip mongering in my house," she declared one evening after Pete Carlson made the mistake of asking if Eliza had been in trouble before coming west. The old woman had stood up from her chair with more speed than seemed possible for someone her age, pointed a gnarled finger at Pete's face, and told him if he opened his mouth on that subject again, she'd throw him out in the snow without his coat. Pete had shut up fast, but the damage was done. The question had been asked, and now it hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Eliza worked harder, woke earlier, stayed up later, scrubbed floors that didn't need scrubbing and mended clothes that weren't torn. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from circling the same dark thoughts over and over. What if Davies came back? What if the real robbers were never caught? What if she spent the rest of her life in Black Hollow branded as a criminal based on nothing but bad timing and a stranger's face? What if Rowan's lie was discovered and he suffered for trying to protect her? That last thought kept her up at night more than any of the others. February arrived with temperatures so cold the pump froze solid and had to be thawed with boiling water every morning. Eliza was carrying buckets from the well one gray afternoon when she heard shouting from the direction of Main Street. She set the buckets down and moved closer, staying in the shadows between buildings. A crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office. Maybe 20 people, maybe more, all talking at once with voices pitched high and angry. Eliza spotted the Morrisons, the ranching family that had lost cattle to rustlers, and several other men she recognized from the Mercantile. Sheriff Davies stood on the steps of his office, hands raised for quiet. He looked even less competent than usual, sweat visible on his face despite the cold. "Folks, I need you to calm down." "Calm down?" A tall man in a rancher's coat stepped forward. "You telling me to calm down when my ranch got hit last night? 12 head gone, fence cut clean through, and not a damn track left to follow?" "We're investigating it." "You've been investigating for 2 months and haven't caught nobody." The crowd murmured agreement. Someone else shouted, "Maybe if you spent less time harassing innocent women and more time doing your job, we'd have these bastards locked up by now." Eliza's breath caught. They were talking about her. Davies's face flushed red. "Miss Quinn remains a person of interest." Based on what? The speaker was an older woman Eliza didn't recognize. Based on her showing up at the wrong time? That's not evidence. That's laziness. "She fits the description." "So do I," the woman shot back. "So does half the territory. You got anything real on her, or are you just grasping at straws because you got no other leads?" The crowd was turning. Eliza could see it in the way people shifted, the way Davies' deputies looked at each other with uncertainty. The anger that had been focused on her, or at least on Davies' pursuit of her, was redirecting itself at the sheriff's incompetence. "There's been another robbery," someone called out. "Stagecoach hit between here and Rollins yesterday. Same pattern, organized, clean, no witnesses." "And where was your suspect then, Sheriff?" The tall rancher crossed his arms. "Because I heard Eliza Quinn was serving lunch at the boarding house same time that coach got robbed. Lots of witnesses to that." Davies opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked like a fish drowning in air. "I want real law enforcement," someone else yelled. "Not this circus." The crowd noise swelled. Davies tried to restore order, failed, tried again. His deputies looked ready to bolt. The whole thing was on the verge of becoming something uglier when a voice cut through the chaos like a knife through butter. "Enough!" Everyone turned. Rowan Mercer stood at the edge of the crowd, still mounted on his roan, looking down at the assembled townspeople with an expression that could freeze fire. "You all want someone to blame," Rowan said, his voice carrying without being raised. "I understand that. Your stock's being stolen, your livelihood's threatened, and the law seems useless. But turning on each other, turning on a woman who's done nothing but try to survive in a place that didn't want her, that's not going to solve anything." "Easy for you to say," the tall rancher called out. "Your ranch hasn't been hit yet. Mine's next on the list, probably. I'm not stupid. But wasting time on Eliza Quinn means the real criminals keep working. They keep stealing. And they keep getting away with it because Davies here is too busy chasing the wrong person." Davies bristled. "Now, you wait just a minute." "No, you wait." Rowan's eyes locked on the sheriff. "You question Miss Quinn based on what? A vague description and the fact that she's an outsider? That's not police work, that's prejudice. Meanwhile, the actual gang, because this is clearly organized crime, not random theft, is laughing at all of us." "You seem awfully invested in defending her," Davies said, his tone sneering. "Makes a man wonder why." "Makes me wonder why you're more interested in gossip than in doing your job." The crowd had gone quiet, watching this confrontation unfold like spectators at a prize fight. Eliza stood frozen in the alley, torn between wanting to run and needing to know how this ended. One of the ranchers spoke up. "Mercer's got a point. These robberies are too clean, too coordinated. Someone's planning them. Someone who knows the territory, knows the schedules, knows which places are vulnerable. Could be anyone," another voice added. "Could be someone who's been here for years, not some woman who just showed up." "Could be someone we trust," the older woman said. "Someone we wouldn't suspect." The implication hung in the air. Eliza saw Davy's face go from red to white as he realized the crowd's suspicion was shifting, not just away from her, but potentially toward people with real power in Black Hollow, people who wouldn't take kindly to being investigated. "I'm doing everything I can," Davies said weakly. "Then do better," Rowan said, "or step aside and let someone else try." He turned his horse and rode away without waiting for a response. The crowd began to break up, people drifting back to their business with the restless energy of a storm that almost broke but didn't quite. Davies retreated into his office, his deputies following like whipped dogs. Eliza stayed in the alley until everyone had dispersed. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The crowd had defended her. Not all of them, maybe not even most of them, but enough. Enough to push back against Davies, enough to question the accusations. And Rowan Mercer had stood up in front of the whole town and called the sheriff out. She picked up her water buckets and walked back to the boarding house on shaking legs. Mrs. Henderson was waiting in the kitchen. "You heard?" "Most of it." "Good." The old woman settled into her chair by the stove. "Maybe now people will start using their brains instead of their mouths. Or maybe it just makes things worse. Can't get much worse than being accused of bank robbery based on having dark hair and bad luck." Mrs. Henderson fixed Eliza with a shrewd look. "Rowan Mercer's making enemies defending you." "I know. You care about that?" Eliza thought about the question. About Rowan sitting alone in his cabin. About the wife and child he'd lost. About the way he'd looked at her in the rain and decided helping was more important than protecting himself. "Yes," she said quietly. "I care." Figured as much. Mrs. Henderson closed her eyes. "Be careful with that. Caring's dangerous in a place like this. Everything's dangerous in a place like this." True enough, that night, Eliza couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed and listened to the wind howl around the corners of the boarding house, rattling windows and finding every gap in the walls. Her mind wouldn't settle. Kept replaying the scene outside the sheriff's office. Kept hearing Rowan's voice cutting through the crowd. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep and wrapped herself in her shawl. Crept downstairs to the kitchen where the stove still held warmth from the evening's fire. She was adding wood, watching the flames catch, when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Margaret Chen appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a thick robe, her hair in a long braid over one shoulder. "Can't sleep either?" Margaret asked. "Too much noise in my head. I know that feeling." Margaret moved to the table and sat down. "After my husband died, I'd lie awake for hours just thinking in circles. Couldn't shut it off." Eliza joined her at the table. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the pop and crackle of the fire. "People surprise you sometimes," Margaret said eventually. "I thought this town would stay against you forever, but today, some of them actually used their heads." "Some, not all. Some's better than none." Margaret traced a pattern on the table with her finger. "When I first came here with my husband, people wouldn't even look at me. Chinese woman married to a white man? Scandal, sin, all kinds of ugly words. Took 2 years before anyone would speak to me directly instead of talking around me like I was furniture." "What changed?" "Cholera outbreak. I knew how to treat it, learned from my mother back in San Francisco. Suddenly all those people who wouldn't look at me needed my help, needed my knowledge. I could have turned them away, probably should have, but I didn't." Margaret's expression hardened slightly. "Didn't do it for them, though. Did it because letting people die out of spite makes you just as bad as they are." "Do they treat you better now?" "Some do. Some still cross the street. But I stopped caring what they think somewhere along the way. I know what I'm worth. Know what I can do. Their opinions don't change that." Eliza absorbed this. "How do you get to that place? Where their opinions don't matter. You decide that surviving is more important than being liked. You decide that building a life, even a hard one, even a lonely one, matters more than winning approval from people who weren't going to give it anyway. Margaret looked at her directly. You're already doing it, Eliza. You just don't realize it yet. Doesn't feel like it. Feeling and fact are different things. Fact is, you're still here, you're still working, you're still standing upright when this town's done everything it can to knock you down. That's not weakness, that's strength. Before Eliza could respond, they heard horses outside, multiple horses, moving fast. Margaret stood and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see out. Sheriff's deputies, she said, heading south in a hurry. This time of night, something's happened. They found out the next morning when Samuel Briggs came back from the sawmill with news. Another ranch had been hit. The Hendersons, no relation to their landlady, a family with 3 children and a small herd of cattle they could barely afford to lose. The rustlers had taken everything, every last cow. Cut the fence, drove the animals off, and disappeared into the night like ghosts. Families ruined, Samuel said quietly over breakfast. They mortgaged everything to build that herd. Now it's gone, and they got nothing but debt. Did anyone see who did it? Pete Carlson asked. Not a soul, same as always. In and out clean, no tracks, no witnesses. Samuel shook his head. This gang, whoever they are, they're professionals. Ain't no random thieves. The Carlson brothers exchanged glances. Jack spoke up. Railroad's been talking about hiring private security. Pinkerton men, maybe. Bring in real investigators since the local law can't handle it. That'll cost money, his brother said, less than what we're losing to theft. The conversation continued, but Eliza stopped listening. She was thinking about the Henderson family, about 3 children watching their future get stolen in the night, about how helpless they must feel, how violated. She knew something about that. After breakfast, she bundled up and walked to the mercantile. Clayton was behind the counter as usual, his beard neatly trimmed, his eyes watchful. Miss Quinn, what can I do for you? The Henderson family, Eliza said. The ones who got robbed? Do they need anything? Food, supplies? Clayton's eyebrows rose. That's charitable of you. That's practical. They have children. Children need to eat. He studied her for a long moment. They could use everything. Lost their cattle, which means no income. Got nothing put by for winter. I have $3 saved. It's not much, but take it. Use it for whatever they need most. $3 is a month's wages for you. I know what it is. Clayton didn't move to take the money. Why are you doing this? These people, they're part of the town that's been treating you like a criminal. Eliza set the bills on the counter. Because they didn't rob themselves. Because they're suffering. And because spite doesn't put food in children's bellies. She turned to leave, but Clayton's voice stopped her. Miss Quinn? She looked back. You're a better person than most folks around here deserve. Eliza didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and walked out. The news of her donation spread faster than she expected. By evening, Mrs. Henderson had heard about it. By the next morning, half the town knew. The whispers changed tone slightly, not friendly exactly, but less hostile, more confused. Like people couldn't quite reconcile the image of a bank robber with someone who gave away a month's wages to help strangers. 3 days after the Henderson robbery, a rider came to the boarding house looking for Eliza. He was young, maybe 17, with nervous hands and a letter clutched tight. Miss Quinn, I'm supposed to give this to you. Eliza took the letter. The handwriting on the envelope was neat, careful. She didn't recognize it. Who's it from? Mrs. Henderson, the rancher's wife, I mean. Not your Mrs. Henderson. Thank you. The boy nodded and left. Eliza stood on the porch holding the letter, almost afraid to open it. Finally, she broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The note was short. Miss Quinn, Clayton told us what you did. We don't know you, and we got no right to your kindness, but we're grateful for it. My children ate better this week because of you. That matters more than I can say. People in town talk about you like they know your character. They don't. But we wanted you to know that in our house, you'll always be welcome. Whatever the gossips say, we know what kindness looks like. Thank you. Sarah Henderson. Eliza read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. Something warm and painful was lodged in her chest. She'd expected nothing from that donation, certainly not gratitude, certainly not this. She went inside and found Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen. You knew what would happen when I donated that money, Eliza said. The old woman looked up from the pot she was stirring. Knew what? That people would hear about it, that it would change how they see me. I suspected. I didn't know for certain. But you hoped. Mrs. Henderson set down her spoon. I've lived in this town for 40 years, Eliza. I've seen good people get torn down by gossip, and bad people get praised because they knew the right things to say. I've seen reputations destroyed over nothing, and crimes forgiven because the criminal had friends. She paused. Sometimes the truth needs a little help to get seen. You giving that money that showed people something true about who you are. Something Davy's accusations can't touch. You manipulated me. I gave you information and let you make your own choice. You chose kindness. That's on you, not me. Eliza wanted to be angry, but she couldn't quite manage it. Mrs. Henderson had pushed her toward something good, even if the method was questionable. And the result was a letter in her pocket that made her feel less alone. Thank you, Eliza said quietly. Don't thank me. Just keep being who you are. It's working better than you think. The rest of February brought more cold, more snow, and mercifully, no more robberies. Either the gang had moved on or they were waiting for something. Whatever the reason, the attack stopped and the town breathed a little easier. Sheriff Davies made one more attempt to question Eliza, showing up at the boarding house with that same self-important swagger. Mrs. Henderson met him at the door with a face like winter itself. You got a warrant, Sheriff? I don't need a warrant to ask questions. You need one to enter my property, and you need evidence to harass my employee. Since you got neither, I suggest you get back on your horse and find some actual criminals to bother. I'm investigating. You're avoiding real work by picking on someone who can't fight back. Well, she might not fight back, but I sure as hell will. Now get off my porch before I call every rancher in this valley and tell them you're wasting time on innocent women while their cattle get stolen. Davies left. He didn't come back. March arrived with the first hints of thaw. The snow began to melt in earnest, turning every road into a river of mud and every path into a challenge. The boarding house roof developed a leak that required Samuel Briggs and the Carlson brothers to patch in a rainstorm. Margaret's laundry business picked up as people needed their winter clothes cleaned before storing them away. And Eliza noticed something changing in how people treated her. It wasn't dramatic. No one apologized directly. No one said, "We were wrong about you." But the doctor's wife nodded to her on the street instead of crossing to avoid her. The blacksmith went back to quoting her normal prices. A few women she'd never spoken to before stopped by the boarding house to drop off mending work, offering to pay for her services. Small gestures, tiny shifts, but they added up to something that felt like acceptance, or at least the beginning of it. She saw Rowan in town one afternoon in mid-March. He was loading supplies into his saddlebags outside the mercantile, his movements efficient and practiced. Eliza almost walked past without stopping. They hadn't spoken since his confrontation with the sheriff, and she wasn't sure what to say to him. But he looked up and saw her, and something in his expression made her pause. Eliza. Rowan. They stood there in awkward silence. A wagon rolled past, splashing mud. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. I heard what you did, Rowan said finally. For the Henderson family. News travels. It does. He tied off a strap on his saddlebag. That was a good thing. It was the right thing. There's a difference. Not sure there is. He glanced at her, then away. People are talking differently about you now. I noticed. Good. Maybe they'll finally start seeing what I saw back at that station. What's that? Someone worth helping. The words hit her harder than they should have. Eliza felt her throat tighten. You didn't have to defend me to Davies. Didn't have to lie for me. Wasn't lying. Was telling a truth that mattered more than the details. That's splitting hairs. Maybe, but I'm not losing sleep over it. Rowan picked up his reins. You staying in Black Hollow, or moving on come spring? The question caught her off guard. She hadn't let herself think that far ahead, hadn't let herself imagine a future beyond surviving the present. I don't know, she said honestly. I have work here. Mrs. Henderson needs help, but I don't know if I want to stay somewhere I had to fight this hard just to be left alone. Everywhere's a fight in one way or another. Question is whether the fight's worth it. Is it? For you? Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Some days yes, some days no, but I got land here. Got history, even if most of it's painful. Leaving means starting over somewhere else, and I'm not sure I got the energy for that. That's not the same as saying you're happy here. No, it's not. He swung up into the saddle, but happiness and staying put aren't always connected. Sometimes you just survive where you landed and try to make it mean something. He rode off before Eliza could respond, leaving her standing in the muddy street with those words echoing in her head. That night, she lay in bed and thought about what Rowan had said, about surviving where you landed, about making it mean something. She thought about the attic room that had become home despite its size, about Mrs. Henderson's sharp kindness and Margaret's quiet strength, about the letter from Sarah Henderson folded in her drawer. She thought about Philadelphia and the boarding house there, about the life she'd left behind without regret, about Thomas Garrett's lies and the future that had never existed. And she thought about Black Hollow, harsh and judgmental and cold, but also the place where people had eventually started to see her as a person instead of just a problem. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was more than enough. Or maybe she was just too tired to imagine anything else. Spring edged closer. The days grew longer. The ice broke on the creek. And Eliza Quinn kept working, kept surviving, kept building something out of the wreckage of everything she'd lost. She didn't know yet that the worst was still coming, that the accusations and the gossip had been just the beginning, that soon she'd have to choose between running and fighting, between protecting herself and protecting people who'd barely given her a chance. She didn't know that by the time April arrived, everything would change again. But for now, in the quiet space between winter and spring, she had work and shelter and the strange, complicated gratitude of people who were learning, slowly, grudgingly, that she wasn't who they'd decided she was. For now, that was enough to keep her going. The break came on a Tuesday morning in late March, when the temperature had climbed just high enough to turn the snow into slush and make every step outside an exercise in staying upright. Eliza was kneading bread dough in the boarding house kitchen, her hands working the rhythm she'd learned years ago when she heard horses thundering down Main Street. Not the usual pace of someone running errands. This was urgent. This was trouble. She wiped flour from her hands and moved to the window. Through the wavy glass, she could see riders dismounting outside the sheriff's office. 5 men, maybe 6, all talking at once with gestures sharp enough to cut air. One of them was pointing north, toward the mountains. Another was shaking his head violently. Mrs. Henderson appeared beside her. "What's happening?" "Don't know, but it's not good." They didn't have to wait long to find out. Pete Carlson came running into the boarding house 20 minutes later, barely pausing to knock, his face flushed with excitement and something darker. "They caught them," he said, breathing hard. "The rustlers caught them red-handed trying to move stolen cattle through Copper Canyon." Eliza's stomach dropped. Who caught them? Ranchers from the Morrison place, plus some railroad men, set up an ambush based on a tip someone gave the sheriff. There was shooting. One of the thieves is dead, 2 more wounded, rest scattered into the hills. "Anyone else hurt?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "Few of our boys took bullets, but they'll live. Morrison's oldest son got winged in the shoulder." Pete was practically vibrating with energy. "But here's the thing. They're bringing the captured ones back to town now. Should be here within the hour. Sheriff's calling for a gathering at the square. Everyone's going to want to see who's been stealing from us all this time." He ran back out without waiting for a response, probably to spread the news to the next house. Mrs. Henderson and Eliza looked at each other. "You should stay here," the old woman said. "Why?" "Because mobs are unpredictable. People get worked up, they stop thinking straight, and you're still—" She paused, choosing her words. "You're still not fully trusted. Best not to give anyone a reason to point fingers again." Eliza wanted to argue, but Mrs. Henderson was right. The town had softened toward her, but that didn't mean they'd forgotten their suspicions. Better to stay invisible until the dust settled. Except staying invisible meant not knowing what was happening, and not knowing felt worse than the risk. "I'll stay out of sight," Eliza said, "but I'm going to watch from somewhere. I need to see this." Mrs. Henderson sighed, but didn't fight it. "Be careful. And if things turn ugly, you run straight back here. Understand?" "I understand." By noon, the entire town had gathered in the square near the sheriff's office. Eliza positioned herself at the edge of the crowd, half hidden behind the corner of the mercantile building. From here, she could see without being seen, could hear the murmur of voices growing louder as anticipation built. Margaret Chen appeared beside her, quiet as always. Figured you'd be here. Couldn't stay away. Me neither. Margaret crossed her arms against the cold. If these are really the people who've been terrorizing the ranches, this might finally put an end to all the accusations. Might let you breathe easier. Might. They waited. The crowd grew restless. Children ran between adults' legs until parents grabbed them and held them close. Men checked their rifles. Women whispered behind their hands. Then the riders appeared at the north end of Main Street. The Morrison men came first, rifles across their saddles, faces grim with victory and exhaustion. Behind them came Sheriff Davies and his deputies, looking simultaneously relieved and anxious. And between the deputies rode 4 horses carrying prisoners with their hands bound. The crowd surged forward, then stopped as the deputies raised their weapons. Stay back, give us room. The procession made its way to the center of the square. Davies dismounted and gestured for the prisoners to be brought down from their horses. They complied, moving stiffly. 2 were clearly injured, blood seeping through makeshift bandages. One was barely more than a boy, maybe 19, his face pale with fear. The 4th was older, weathered, with eyes that scanned the crowd like he was calculating odds. These are your rustlers, Davies announced, his voice carrying across the square. Caught in Copper Canyon with stolen Morrison cattle. 1 more is dead up in the hills, 2 others escaped, but we'll track them down. Who are they? Someone shouted. Davies looked uncomfortable. That's still being determined. They're not talking. Make them talk! The crowd's energy shifted. Eliza felt it like a change in air pressure before a storm. People who'd been merely curious were now angry, their losses and fear finding a target at last. One of the Morrison men stepped forward. Found brands on those cattle from 6 different ranches. These bastards have been working this territory for months. Cost us thousands of dollars. Cost some families everything. String them up, a voice called out. Several others echoed the sentiment. Davies raised his hands. There'll be a proper trial. We do this legal. Legal takes too long. We know what they did. We have laws for a reason. Laws haven't protected us so far. The argument escalated. Eliza watched the prisoners' faces. The boy looked terrified. One of the wounded men had gone gray, probably from blood loss. The older one still showed no emotion, just kept watching the crowd with those calculating eyes. Then he spoke, his voice cutting through the noise. You want to know who we are? Fine. I'm Jack Sutton. These are my men. We've been working this territory since last fall, and we're damn good at what we do. Would have kept going too if someone hadn't sold us out. Who? Davies demanded. Sutton smiled, showing teeth. Now why would I tell you that? Only leverage I got left. You're in no position to bargain. I'm in a position to make things real interesting if you rush to a hanging. See, we didn't work alone. Had help from someone local, someone who knew which ranches to hit, when the men would be away, where the law would be looking. The crowd went silent. Eliza felt ice form in her stomach. Davies stepped closer to Sutton. You're lying. Am I? How else you think we knew Morrison's schedule? Knew when the railroad payroll was moving? Knew which stagecoaches carried money and which ones carried mail? Sutton's smile widened. We had inside information, good information, and that person's standing somewhere in this crowd right now, sweating bullets. The square erupted. People turned to their neighbors with suspicion. Accusations flew. Davies tried to restore order, but his voice was drowned out. Eliza's mind raced. If Sutton was telling the truth, someone in Black Hollow had been working with the rustlers. Someone respected enough to have access to information. Someone who'd been pointing fingers at outsiders to deflect attention from themselves. Her eyes found Sheriff Davies, who looked genuinely shocked. Either he was a good actor or he hadn't been involved. She scanned the crowd, looking for anyone who seemed too calm, too controlled, too ready with responses. And then she saw him, Clayton, the mercantile owner, standing near the front of the crowd with his arms crossed, his expression neutral, not shocked, not outraged, just watching, as if he'd been expecting this. Eliza remembered all those trips to the mercantile, Clayton asking questions that seemed friendly at the time. Where had she come from? What route had she taken? Had she seen anything unusual on the road? She'd thought he was just making conversation, but what if he'd been gathering information? She thought about the Morrisons losing their cattle the same week Clayton had asked about their herd size, about the stage robbery happening days after Clayton had mentioned which routes were most traveled. about every piece of casual conversation that might have been something else entirely. "Margaret," Eliza said quietly, "does Clayton leave town often?" "Every few weeks. Says he's visiting suppliers, restocking inventory." Margaret followed Eliza's gaze. "Why?" "Just wondering." But her mind was already moving faster. If Clayton was involved, he'd be desperate now. Desperate men did dangerous things. And if Sutton started talking, started naming names, Clayton would need a way out. Or he'd need someone else to take the fall. Eliza's blood ran cold. She grabbed Margaret's arm. "We need to go. Now." "What? Why?" "Because if I'm right about something, I'm about to become a target again." They slipped away from the crowd as Davies tried to move the prisoners into the jail. Made it 3 blocks before they heard running footsteps behind them. Eliza spun around. It was the young deputy, the one who'd questioned Davies' methods during the first interrogation. He was alone, breathing hard. "Miss Quinn, wait." "What do you want?" "To warn you. Davies is going to come after you again. Clayton's been in his ear for the past 10 minutes, saying you might have been working with the rustlers, that you arrived right when the robberies started, that you've been gathering information by working at the boarding house." "That's insane. I've been serving meals and washing sheets." "I know. But Clayton is convincing, and Davies is desperate to close this case without looking incompetent. He's going to arrest you as a suspect within the hour." Margaret stepped forward. "On what evidence?" "Sutton's claims about an inside source. Your history of arriving mysteriously. The fact that you fit the description of one of the women witnesses mentioned seeing near Lewiston." The deputy glanced over his shoulder. "Look, I don't think you're guilty. I think Davies is grasping at straws and Clayton's manipulating him. But that won't stop them from locking you up." "What do I do?" Eliza asked. "Run, hide, or prove your innocence before they come for you. Those are your options." He left before she could ask anything else. Eliza stood in the muddy street, her heart pounding, her mind trying to work through possibilities. Margaret grabbed her shoulders. "You need to talk to Rowan. Now." "Why Rowan?" "Because he's the only person in this town with enough influence to stand up to Davies, and he's already proven he'll protect you. Go. I'll cover for you at the boarding house." Eliza wanted to argue, but Margaret was right. She had maybe an hour before Davies came looking for her. An hour to figure out what to do, where to go, how to prove she wasn't involved with thieves she'd never met. She ran. Rowan's cabin sat quiet in the late afternoon light, smoke rising from the chimney. Eliza approached on foot. She'd run most of the 8 miles, her lungs burning, her legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. She stumbled up to the door and knocked hard. No answer. She knocked again, harder. "Rowan, are you here? I need help." Still nothing. Eliza tried the door. It was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside, calling his name. The cabin was empty but warm, the stove recently tended. He couldn't have gone far. She moved to the window and looked out toward the lean-to. Rowan's roan was there, which meant he was on foot, probably checking fences or hauling water. She'd have to wait. Except she didn't have time to wait. Eliza paced the Smalls' cabin, trying to think. Clayton had set her up. She was almost certain of it now. He'd used her as a convenient scapegoat, knowing she was already suspected, knowing the town would believe the worst. And Davies, incompetent and desperate, would grab at any explanation that made him look effective. She needed proof, something concrete that showed Clayton's involvement. But where would she even start looking? The mercantile. If Clayton was working with the rustlers, there might be evidence at his store, records of unusual purchases, notes about meeting times. Something. It was a long shot. Probably a stupid shot, but it was the only shot she had. Eliza grabbed a piece of paper from Rowan's small desk and scrawled a quick note explaining where she'd gone and why. Left it on the table where he'd see it. Then she headed back toward town, moving as fast as her exhausted body would allow. By the time she reached Black Hollow, the sun was setting and most people had cleared out of the square. The jail was lit up, voices carrying from inside, probably Davies interrogating the prisoners. The mercantile stood dark and closed at the other end of the street. Eliza circled around to the back of the building. The rear door was locked, but the window near the storage room was slightly open. She'd noticed it weeks ago when delivering supplies for Mrs. Henderson. Clayton never quite got it to latch properly. She wedged her fingers under the frame and pushed. The window slid up with a creak that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet evening. Eliza held her breath, waiting to see if anyone had heard. Nothing. She climbed through, landing awkwardly on a pile of flour sacks. The storage room was dark, except for thin light filtering through cracks in the walls. She waited for her eyes to adjust, then moved carefully toward the door that led to the main shop. Clayton's office was a small room behind the counter. Eliza had never been inside, but she'd seen him go in and out enough times to know where he kept his ledgers and papers. She tried the office door, locked. Of course it was locked. She looked around for something to use, found a metal file on one of the shelves. It wasn't ideal, but it might work if she could wedge it into the lock and… Looking for something? Eliza spun around, her heart nearly stopping. Clayton stood in the doorway to the storage room, holding a lantern. His expression was calm, too calm. "I knew you'd come," he said conversationally. "Smart girl like you, you'd figure it out eventually. Sooner than I expected, actually. I thought I had another day or two before you put the pieces together." Eliza's hand tightened on the metal file. "You've been working with the rustlers." "Working with them?" "No. Employing them, more like. They did the dirty work, I provided the information and moved the stolen goods through my supply network. Very profitable arrangement." Clayton set the lantern down on a barrel. "Would have kept going too, except Sutton got greedy. Started hitting ranches I told him to avoid. Drew too much attention." "So you sold him out. Seemed prudent. Let the law catch the muscle, keep the brains free to operate." He smiled. "And you arriving when you did? Well, that was perfect timing. A ready-made suspect with a suspicious background. Even better when Rowan Mercer started defending you, made you seem even more questionable." "You've been manipulating Davies this whole time. Sheriff Davies is an idiot who's easily led. All I had to do was drop a few suggestions in his ear, and he did the rest himself." Clayton took a step closer. "But now we have a problem. You know too much. And unlike Davies, you're not easily manipulated." Eliza backed up until she hit the wall. "People know I'm here. If something happens to me, who knows? Margaret Chen? She's got no proof. Rowan Mercer? He's 8 miles away and has no idea where you are." Clayton shook his head. "No, I think what's going to happen is this. You tried to break into my store to steal money, probably to run, since you knew Davies was coming to arrest you. I caught you in the act. There was a struggle. Tragically, you didn't survive." He pulled a knife from his belt. Not a large knife, but sharp, the kind used for cutting twine and opening crates. Eliza raised the metal file. "Stay back." "You're not going to stab me with that. You're not a killer." Clayton moved closer. "Neither am I, really, but circumstances require it. They'll know it wasn't self-defense. They'll question nothing. The strange woman who arrived under mysterious circumstances, who was already suspected of working with rustlers, broke into my store and attacked me when confronted. I defended myself. End of story." He was only a few feet away now. "It's actually quite neat. Solves all my problems at once." Eliza's mind raced through options. She couldn't fight Clayton. He was bigger, stronger, armed with a real weapon. She couldn't run. He was between her and the door. She could scream, but who would hear? Who would come? Clayton lunged. Eliza threw the metal file at his face and dove sideways. The file caught him across the cheek, drawing blood. He swore and grabbed for her. His hand caught her sleeve, yanking her backward. She twisted, felt the fabric tear, got one arm free. The lantern. It was sitting on the barrel behind Clayton. Eliza grabbed a sack of flour and swung it as hard as she could. It connected with Clayton's shoulder, throwing him off balance. She lunged for the lantern, snatched it up, and threw it at the stack of grain sacks behind him. Glass shattered, oil spilled, fire bloomed. Clayton jumped back, batting at flames that had caught on his coat. Eliza ran for the window she'd climbed through. Behind her, the fire was spreading faster than she'd expected. Dry grain, wooden walls, no shortage of fuel. She hit the window at full speed, tumbled through, landed hard on the ground outside. Scrambled to her feet and ran toward Main Street, screaming. "Fire! The mercantile's on fire!" Doors opened, people emerged. Someone rang the bell that served as the town's alarm. Within minutes, Black Hollow's volunteer fire brigade was hauling water from the well, forming bucket lines, trying to contain the blaze. Eliza stood at the edge of the chaos, shaking. Margaret appeared beside her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "What happened?" "Clayton. He admitted everything. He's been working with the rustlers. He tried to—" Eliza's voice broke. "He tried to kill me. Where is he now?" "Inside. He was inside when I started the fire." Margaret's eyes widened. Eliza, I didn't mean to. I just needed to get away. The lantern, it was an accident. Someone shouted from near the building. I see him! Someone's moving in there! 2 men ran into the burning mercantile. They emerged 30 seconds later, dragging Clayton between them. His face was black with soot, his coat still smoldering. He was conscious but coughing hard, gasping for air. Sheriff Davies pushed through the crowd. What the hell happened here? Ask him, Eliza said, pointing at Clayton. Ask him about the rustlers, about selling information, about trying to kill me when I figured it out. Clayton was still coughing too hard to speak. Davies looked from him to Eliza, confusion and suspicion warring on his face. She's lying, Clayton finally managed to gasp out. She broke into my store, tried to rob me. I caught her and she started the fire to cover her tracks. That's not what happened, a voice said. Everyone turned. Rowan Mercer stood at the edge of the crowd, holding a piece of paper, the note Eliza had left at his cabin. Miss Quinn came to my place an hour ago, Rowan said, walking forward. Left me a note explaining that she suspected Clayton of working with the rustlers and was going to look for proof. She was right. You can't know that, Davies said. I can, because I've suspected Clayton for weeks. Been watching him. Noticed he was always very interested in everyone's business but never got hit himself. Noticed he always knew about trouble before it reached town. Noticed he was real eager to point fingers at Miss Quinn whenever possible. Rowan looked at the sheriff with something like contempt. You were too busy chasing an innocent woman to see the guilty man standing right in front of you. He's lying! Clayton struggled to his feet, still wheezing. They're both lying. This is a setup. Then why did you just try to kill Miss Quinn? Margaret asked quietly. I didn't. She attacked me. With what? Margaret held up the metal file, which she'd apparently retrieved. This? Against your knife? She turned to Davies. Check his belt, Sheriff. See if he's carrying a knife that matches her story. Davies hesitated, then moved to search Clayton. He found the knife still in its sheath, drew it out. The blade was clean, but the handle was new enough that anyone could see it wasn't just for opening crates. This proves nothing, Clayton said, but his voice had lost its confidence. Rowan spoke again. Search his office. If Eliza's right about him working with the rustlers, there'll be records. Supply manifests that don't match actual inventory. Correspondence with buyers for stolen cattle. Something. Davies looked torn. He wanted to dismiss all of this, wanted his easy suspect back. But too many people were watching now. Too many witnesses. He couldn't ignore this. Fine. We'll search the office. But if we don't find anything, you'll find something, Eliza said. I saw papers on his desk before he came in. Financial records that didn't look right. Notes in handwriting that wasn't his. The fire brigade had mostly contained the blaze by now. The main store was damaged but not destroyed, and the office had barely been touched by flames. Davies went inside with 2 deputies. The crowd waited in tense silence. He emerged 20 minutes later holding a ledger and several loose papers. His face was grim. Clayton Davis, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit theft, receiving stolen property, and attempted murder. Clayton's expression crumbled. You don't understand. I needed the money. The store's been failing for years. I was drowning in debt. The rustlers offered a way out. You sold out your neighbors, Rowan said flatly. Helped thieves destroy families, and when someone got close to figuring it out, you tried to murder her. I wasn't going to. I just wanted to scare her. Save it for the judge, Davies nodded to his deputies. Lock him up with Sutton and the others. They can all hang together. As Clayton was led away, still protesting, the crowd began to disperse. The drama was over. The guilty had been caught. Black Hollow could sleep easier. Eliza stood there in her torn dress and Margaret's blanket, shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion and relief so profound it made her dizzy. Rowan approached slowly. You all right? I don't know. Ask me tomorrow. Fair enough. He paused. That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've seen in years, going after him alone like that. Didn't feel brave. Felt desperate. Those things looked similar from the outside. Rowan glanced toward the damaged mercantile. You could have died. I know. Do me a favor and don't do it again. Despite everything, Eliza almost smiled. I'll try. Mrs. Henderson pushed through what remained of the crowd, moving faster than seemed possible for someone her age. She grabbed Eliza in a hug that nearly cracked ribs. Stupid girl. Brilliant, stupid girl. I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson. You're not fine. You're half dead and covered in soot and you smell like smoke. Come on, we're getting you home. Home. The word settled over Eliza like warmth. The boarding house wasn't much, and the attic room was cramped, but Mrs. Henderson had called it home. That meant something. As they walked back through the muddy streets, Margaret on one side and Mrs. Henderson on the other, Eliza let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. She'd been hours, maybe minutes, away from being arrested for crimes she didn't commit, from being locked up or run out of town or worse. But she'd fought back, found the truth, survived. And now Clayton was in jail where he belonged, the real criminals were caught, and Eliza Quinn was finally, definitively cleared. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt like tired. Back at the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson drew a bath and bullied Eliza into it. The water was hot enough to hurt, but it washed away the smoke and the fear. Margaret brought clean clothes. The Carlson brothers appeared with food they'd somehow assembled. Bread and cheese and cold chicken that tasted better than anything Eliza had eaten in months. Samuel Briggs knocked on her door around midnight. Just wanted to say, I never thought you did it. The robbery, I mean. You got an honest face. It was the most words he'd spoken to her in 3 months. By the time Eliza finally crawled into bed, her whole body ached and her mind felt scraped raw. But she was safe. And she was, however improbably, home. She slept without dreams and woke to sunlight streaming through her small window. The morning after the fire brought what Eliza had stopped expecting: apologies. They came awkwardly, wrapped in half sentences and averted eyes. The doctor's wife appeared at the boarding house with a basket of preserves, mumbling something about having misjudged the situation. A rancher named Peters stopped Eliza on the street to say he'd been wrong to suspect her. Even the blacksmith knocked 50 cents off her bill for the hinges Mrs. Henderson had ordered, though he couldn't quite bring himself to say why. Eliza accepted each gesture with quiet grace, but inside she felt hollowed out. These were the same people who'd crossed the street to avoid her, who'd whispered behind their hands and looked at her like she carried disease. Now they wanted forgiveness because the truth had proven inconvenient to ignore. She gave it anyway. Not because they deserved it, but because holding on to anger would poison her more than it would hurt them. Sheriff Davies came to the boarding house 3 days after Clayton's arrest. He stood on the porch, looking like a man who'd aged a decade overnight, his hat in his hands, his face drawn. "Miss Quinn, could I have a word?" Eliza dried her hands on her apron and stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "What do you want, Sheriff?" "To apologize. Properly." He shifted his weight. "I was wrong about you, dead wrong. I let my own incompetence and Clayton's manipulation turn me into something I'm ashamed of. You tried to arrest me twice for crimes I didn't commit. I know. You made my life hell for months." "I know that too." Davies met her eyes, and she saw genuine remorse there. "I got no excuse that makes it right. I was lazy and scared and looking for easy answers instead of real ones. You paid the price for that." Eliza studied him. She could reject this apology, could tell him it wasn't enough, that sorry didn't undo the damage. All of that would be true. But Davies looked like he already knew it. "What happens to Clayton?" she asked instead. "Trial's set for next month. Judge Harper's coming from Cheyenne. Clayton and the rustlers will all face charges together." Davies put his hat back on. "He'll hang. They all will, most likely. What they did, the families they destroyed, there's no coming back from that." "And you?" "Me? Are you staying on as sheriff?" Davies was quiet for a long moment. "Town council's been asking the same question. I offered to step down, but they want me to stay through the trial. After that," he shrugged, "we'll see. Maybe it's time for someone else to wear the badge. Someone who'll do the job right." He left without asking for forgiveness again. Eliza watched him go and felt something shift inside her. The anger she'd been carrying, the resentment at being judged, suspected, condemned without cause, started to loosen its grip. Not because Davies deserved her mercy, but because she deserved to stop carrying that weight. Margaret found her still standing on the porch 10 minutes later. "You all right?" "I think so, or I will be." Eliza turned to face her friend. Davies apologized. "Did you accept?" "In a way. I didn't tell him he was forgiven. But I didn't throw it back in his face either. Margaret nodded. That's probably wise. Forgiveness isn't always about the other person. Sometimes it's just about deciding you're done letting them take up space in your head. Is that what you did with the people who treated you badly? Eventually, took longer than I'd like to admit. Margaret leaned against the porch rail. But I learned something important along the way. You can't control what people think of you. You can only control what you know about yourself. And once you really know that, once you're solid in who you are, their opinions stop mattering so much. I'm not there yet. You're closer than you think. That afternoon, Rowan Mercer came to town. Eliza saw him from the boarding house window, riding down Main Street on his roan, moving with that same quiet confidence he always carried. He stopped at what remained of the Mercantile, where workers were already clearing debris and salvaging what could be saved. The town needed a general store, and the building's bones were solid enough to rebuild. Eliza watched him talk to the foreman, gesturing at the damaged structure, clearly discussing something important. Then he glanced toward the boarding house, and even from this distance, she felt his gaze land on her. He didn't come over immediately. Instead, he finished his business at the Mercantile, stopped at the sheriff's office for what looked like a tense conversation, and only then walked to Mrs. Henderson's front door. Eliza met him on the porch before he could knock. Rowan. Eliza. He looked her over, assessing. You healing up? Mostly. Few bruises, some sore muscles, nothing that won't fade. Good. He was quiet for a moment, then said, I wanted to check on you. Make sure you weren't doing something stupid like deciding to leave town now that all this is over. The comment caught her off guard. Why would I leave? Because this place put you through hell. Because you've got every reason to shake the dust off your boots and find somewhere that'll treat you better from the start. Eliza considered this. She had thought about leaving, late at night when the memories pressed too hard, when she remembered the rain at Black Hollow Station and the hopeless feeling of being abandoned. But then she thought about Mrs. Henderson's fierce loyalty and Margaret's quiet friendship, about the Henderson family's letter and Samuel Briggs's simple trust, about the attic room that had somehow become home. I'm not leaving, she said. Not yet, anyway. Maybe not ever. Something in Rowan's expression softened. Good. Place wouldn't be the same without you. Place barely tolerated me until a few days ago. Place is learning. Just took a while. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with whatever he wanted to say next. Listen, I've been thinking, the Mercantile needs someone to run it while it's being rebuilt. Town council's looking for a temporary manager who knows inventory and books and dealing with people. And you're telling me this why? Because you'd be good at it. You ran the finances for that boarding house in Philadelphia when the owner was sick. You know how to manage supplies and orders, and after everything you've done, catching Clayton, proving your innocence, people would trust you. Eliza stared at him. You want me to run the Mercantile? I'm suggesting it. Decision's yours. Rowan looked out at the street. Pay would be better than the boarding house. Give you a chance to save money, maybe buy your own place eventually. And it'd show this town that you're not just surviving here, you're building something. Mrs. Henderson needs me. Mrs. Henderson needs help, but she's got options. She could hire someone else, take on fewer boarders, adjust. But this opportunity won't wait forever. Someone else will take it if you don't. Eliza's mind raced. Running the Mercantile would mean visibility, responsibility, putting herself in the center of town instead of hiding in the boarding house kitchen. It would mean trusting that the people who'd apologized actually meant it, that the town had truly turned a corner. It would mean taking a risk. I need to think about it, she said. Fair enough, but think fast. Council's meeting tomorrow to make a decision. He left, and Eliza went back inside to find Mrs. Henderson listening from the hallway. You should take it, the old woman said without preamble. I thought you needed my help. I do, but I need you to have a future more. Mrs. Henderson moved into the kitchen and sat in her chair by the stove. You're good at this work, Eliza, but you're meant for more than washing dishes and making beds. You've got a head for business and a spine like iron. The Mercantile would be lucky to have you. What if people don't accept it? What if they still don't trust me? Then you prove them wrong. Again. Mrs. Henderson smiled, the expression crinkling her weathered face. Besides, you've already done the hard part. You survived their worst. Everything else is just details. Margaret agreed when Eliza asked her opinion that evening. So did the Carlson brothers, who seemed genuinely excited at the prospect of buying their supplies from someone who might give them a discount. Even Samuel Briggs offered a quiet, "You'd do good at it." By the time Eliza went to bed that night, her decision was made. The next morning, she walked to the town council meeting and told them she'd take the job. The work started immediately. The mercantile's inventory had survived the fire mostly intact. It was the structure itself that needed repair. Eliza spent the first week cataloging stock, organizing supplies, and learning the business from the foreman overseeing the reconstruction. She discovered she had a natural talent for numbers and negotiation, for knowing what people needed before they asked. The customers who'd once avoided her now came seeking her help. Some were genuinely friendly. Others were just practical. They needed flour and nails and coffee, and Eliza was the one who could provide it. She treated everyone the same, with professional courtesy that didn't require warmth, but didn't harbor resentment either. Slowly, the mercantile took shape again. New walls replaced charred ones. Fresh paint covered smoke damage. The front counter was rebuilt, stronger than before. And Eliza Quinn stood behind it, no longer the stranger from the station, but the woman running Black Hollow's most important business. Rowan came by every few days, ostensibly to check on the reconstruction, but really to check on her. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm, not quite friendship, not quite something else, but a connection built on shared understanding and hard-won trust. One afternoon in late April, with the mercantile nearly finished and spring settling over the valley in earnest, Rowan found Eliza out back inventorying new stock. "How's it going?" he asked. "Good. We'll be ready to fully reopen next week." She marked something in her ledger. "Town council's already asking if I want to make this permanent. Manage the place long-term instead of just temporarily." "What'd you tell them?" "That I'm considering it." Eliza set down her pencil and looked at him. "Strange, isn't it? 6 months ago, I was sitting in the rain at that station with nothing. Now I'm being offered a real position, a real future. Doesn't feel real yet." "It's real. You earned it." "Did I? Or did I just survive long enough for the truth to come out?" Rowan was quiet for a moment. "You want my honest answer?" "Always." "Both. You survived, which takes strength most people don't have. But you also made choices along the way, helped the Henderson family, proved your character, risked your life to catch Clayton. Those weren't just survival. Those were you deciding what kind of person you wanted to be." Eliza felt something warm settle in her chest. "Thank you for that, for seeing it that way." "I'm just seeing what's there." He paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Those letters Thomas Garrett sent you, the ones that brought you here in the first place, you ever burn them?" The question surprised her. She'd thought about those letters often in the early days, had even pulled them out a few times to reread, torturing herself with the gap between promises and reality. But lately, she hadn't thought about them at all. "No," she admitted. "They're still in my trunk. I don't know why I kept them. Maybe because they're part of your story. The part that hurts, but also the part that brought you here." Rowan looked out at the mountains in the distance. "I kept my wife's things for 3 years. Her clothes, her letters, everything. Couldn't let go. Then one day I realized I was holding on to grief instead of memory. So I packed it all away. Didn't throw it out, just put it somewhere I wasn't tripping over it every day. Made it easier to remember her without drowning in the loss." "You think I should do the same with the letters?" "I think you should do whatever helps you move forward. If keeping them serves a purpose, keep them. If they're just weighing you down, let them go." That evening, Eliza climbed to her attic room and pulled out her trunk. The letters from Thomas Garrett sat at the bottom, tied with string, their edges worn from handling. She untied the bundle and read through them one last time. They were beautiful lies, every one of them. Carefully crafted words designed to appeal to a lonely woman's hopes. Reading them now, with clear eyes and hard-won wisdom, she could see the manipulation. The promises were too perfect. The future too bright. He told her exactly what she wanted to hear because that's what men like him did. But these letters had also given her the courage to leave Philadelphia, to take a risk on something unknown. And that risk, however misguided, had led her here, to Black Hollow, to Mrs. Henderson and Margaret and Rowan, to discovering she was stronger than she'd known, to building a life from nothing because she'd had no other choice, Eliza carried the letters downstairs to the kitchen. The stove was still warm from dinner. She fed the papers into the flames one by one, watching Thomas Garrett's promises curl and blacken and turn to ash. It didn't hurt the way she'd expected. It felt more like closing a door that had been left open too long, letting in cold air and old pain. When the last letter had burned, Eliza closed the stove and went back upstairs. She slept better that night than she had in months. The Mercantile reopened the first week of May with a celebration that brought the whole town out. Someone had strung bunting across the front. The doctor's wife provided cakes. The Carlson brothers, already half drunk by noon, led everyone in a ragged chorus of songs that had nothing to do with general stores, but plenty to do with high spirits. Eliza stood behind the counter in a new dress Mrs. Henderson had insisted on buying, greeting customers, making sales, and feeling something she hadn't felt since before her father died, like she belonged somewhere. Sarah Henderson came with her 3 children, the youngest barely old enough to walk. "Miss Quinn, I wanted to thank you again for everything. You already thanked me more than once." "Not for this," Sarah gestured at the store. "For showing my kids that good people exist, that when someone needs help, there are folks who step up instead of stepping away. They've been talking about you non-stop. You're their hero." Eliza's throat tightened. "I'm nobody's hero. I just did what needed doing." "That's exactly what heroes do. They just don't call it that." As the day wore on, Eliza noticed Rowan standing at the edge of the crowd, not joining the celebration but watching it with something like satisfaction. She caught his eye and he nodded, just a small acknowledgement, but it carried weight. When the crowd finally dispersed and Eliza was closing up for the night, Rowan appeared at the door. "Good first day?" "Better than I expected. Sold out of 3 different items and took orders for a dozen more. Told you you'd be good at this." He stepped inside, looking around at the rebuilt space. "Place looks good. Better than before, actually. Everything's better after it's been through fire and survived." Eliza locked the cash box. "You heading back to your cabin?" "Was planning to. Why?" "Just wondering if you ever get lonely out there. All that space, all that quiet." Rowan considered the question. "Sometimes, but lonely's not always bad. It's just present, like rain or wind, something you learn to live with." "You don't have to, though. Live with it, I mean." Eliza surprised herself with the boldness. "You could come to town more often, could have dinner at the boarding house sometimes, could be part of things instead of just watching from the edges." "Is that an invitation?" "It's an observation, and maybe a suggestion." Something shifted in Rowan's expression, not quite a smile, but close. "I'll think about it." "That's all I'm asking." He left, and Eliza finished closing up, walked back to the boarding house through streets that no longer felt hostile. The evening was warm, the sky clear, the mountains in the distance still snow-capped but softer somehow in the spring light. Mrs. Henderson was waiting in the kitchen with tea and the knowing look of someone who'd been watching carefully. "He's sweet on you, you know." Eliza felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Who?" "Don't play coy. Rowan Mercer. Been sweet on you since the day he found you at that station. Just took him a while to admit it to himself. He's never said anything. Men like Rowan don't say things. They show them. He defended you when no one else would, protected you at risk to himself, helped you get this job. That's not just kindness, that's caring. Even if that's true, I don't know if I'm ready for whatever that would mean. I came here for one man's lies. I'm not sure I can trust my judgment about another man's truth." Mrs. Henderson poured tea with steady hands despite the arthritis. "Thomas Garrett lied to you because he was a liar. That doesn't mean every man is. And Rowan's shown you exactly who he is. No pretense, no false promises, just solid, honest action. If you can't trust that, what can you trust?" Eliza sipped her tea and didn't answer. But the question stayed with her long after she'd gone to bed. Summer arrived with heat that turned the valley golden and dry. The Mercantile thrived under Eliza's management. The town council made her position permanent with a salary that let her start saving real money. She moved out of the boarding house into a small cabin behind the store. Nothing fancy, but it was hers. Her own space. Her own home. Rowan did start coming to town more often. Had dinner at the boarding house once a week. Helped with heavy lifting when the Mercantile needed supplies moved. Sat with Eliza on her porch some evenings, talking about nothing in particular, just existing in comfortable silence. They didn't rush into anything, didn't force what wasn't ready, but slowly, carefully, something was building between them, something that felt different from the desperate hope she'd brought to Black Hollow. This was steadier, quieter, built on knowing instead of wishing. One evening in late August, they sat on Eliza's porch watching the sun set over the mountains. The air was cooling after a hot day, carrying the smell of sage and dust. "You ever regret it?" Rowan asked. "Coming here? Everything you went through?" Eliza thought about the question, about the rain at Black Hollow Station and the fear and the months of suspicion, about nearly being arrested, nearly being killed, about losing everything she'd planned and having to build something completely different from the ashes. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it. It broke me in a lot of ways, but it also showed me I could survive being broken, showed me I was stronger than I thought. That matters more than the pain." "You think you'll stay, long term?" "I think so. I've got a business here, friends, a home. That's more than I had in Philadelphia, more than Thomas Garrett's lies ever would have given me." She looked at Rowan. "What about you? Still planning to stay on your land until you die of stubbornness?" He almost smiled. "Maybe not that long. Been thinking lately that surviving isn't the same as living, that maybe it's time to stop just existing and start building something that matters." "Like what?" "Don't know yet, but I figure I've got time to find out. We both do." They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the mountains and the first stars appeared. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Closer, the town settled into evening routines. Lamps lit, doors closed, families gathering. Eliza thought about all the paths that had led her here. The lies, the losses, the rain that had soaked her to the bone, and the stranger who'd offered shelter. The gossip and accusations, and the fire that had nearly killed her. The slow, hard work of proving herself worthy of a place she'd never asked to be. None of it had been easy. None of it had gone according to plan. But here she was anyway, still standing, still building, still finding reasons to stay. The storm that had stranded her at Black Hollow Station felt like a lifetime ago. But in some ways, she was still the woman who'd stood in that rain, just stronger now, wiser, more certain of who she was and what she deserved. She'd come west looking for a future someone else had promised. Instead, she'd built one herself. That seemed like enough, more than enough. As darkness settled over Black Hollow and Rowan sat beside her in comfortable quiet, Eliza Quinn allowed herself something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Not the desperate kind that had brought her here, but the steady kind that came from knowing she could handle whatever came next. The rain had brought her to this place, but she'd chosen to stay, chosen to fight, chosen to build. And in choosing, she'd found something Thomas Garrett's letters could never have given her. A home that was real because she'd made it so. The storm was over. What came after was hers to shape. And that, finally, was exactly how it should be.